The assassin actually got into his den must have created total panic. You can just imagine it.
A year passed before Saladin returned, determined to capture Aleppo. This time he was taking no chances. He ringed his quarters with guards and even scattered chalk dust and cinders around the tent to detect footprints. Still, despite the security, the assassins struck again, in a curious and disturbing way. By his pillow, they left a present, some pastries, and with them a death note warning Saladin to retreat, or next time they would succeed in assassinating him. Saladin fled Aleppo again. It was 7 years before Saladin's fortunes changed. In 1181, his rival, al-Salih, now 19 years old, died. Like his father and grandfather before him, another victim to die in uncertain circumstances.
I have no problems in believing that Saladin was ruthless. What's the problem? I mean, in order to survive in that world, you had to be. Whether he was responsible for the killing of Nur al-Din's son, one doesn't know.
Syria and Egypt now belonged to Saladin. 80 years of Muslim disunity were over.
Now he has encircled the Crusader states. He is threatening to strangle them into oblivion. And I think what we can see happening as far as the Crusaders are concerned is a real heightening of the temperature, a heightening of the level of threat, and an awareness that really things are moving inexorably towards some kind of serious confrontation.
Having fought and bullied the Muslim world into a coalition, Saladin would now have to deliver a knockout blow against the Christians of the Holy Land. By 1183, Saladin was at last ready to strike against the Christians and claim Jerusalem. The ambition of the greatest Muslim leader in the century hung like a cloud over the Crusaders as they prepared to do battle for their kingdom.
Any rise in Saladin's power was a cause for suspicion in our eyes. He was a man wise in counsel and valiant in war. So we had great reason to fear that when Saladin had increased his empire twofold, he would rise against the kingdom with greater force and harass us more violently than ever.
While the Muslims were unified, the Christians in Jerusalem were at their weakest. They were led by Baldwin IV, a king who from an early age had been crippled by disease.
He was playing one day, and as playful boys do, they began to pinch each other's arms. The other boys gave evidence of pain. But Baldwin felt nothing. As he began to reach years of maturity, it became apparent that he was suffering from the terrible disease of leprosy. Impossible to refrain from tears when speaking of this great misfortune. Day by day, his condition grew worse.
Baldwin became so ill, it was clear he could no longer rule his kingdom. In the autumn of 1183, from his sickbed, he appointed his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, as regent of the realm. Many thought Guy too weak to rule, but he was determined to prove his leadership by taking on the might of Saladin. He would be helped by an ally at court, a brutal prince with a deep hatred of Saladin, Reynald of Châtillon. It was Reynald who would trigger the long-awaited war. For 4 decades, Christians had respected the rights of Muslims to pass through their territory on trade routes between Egypt and Syria. But in January 1187, Reynald broke the truce. launched an unprovoked attack on a richly laden Muslim caravan. He took the noblemen and women prisoner and plundered their possessions.
He seized it treacherously, taking the booty, animals, and the weapons. He threw all the travelers in dungeons, maltreating and torturing them. When they reminded him of the truth, he replied, "Tell your Muhammad to release you."
When news of this attack was brought to Saladin, he said, "This is unacceptable, killing unarmed pilgrims on their way to worship, and whatever else I do or don't do, this is one head I must have."
Reynald's brutal attack gave Saladin his excuse for war. He gathered a formidable army, drawn from every corner of his empire. With 20,000 foot soldiers and over 10,000 cavalry, he marched towards Hattin, near the shores of Lake Galilee.
Till that point that army was created, Saladin was viewed essentially as an important leader, but one amongst many, who had basically been fighting his own side in order to achieve this unity. The first big chance for him to show what this army he had created was capable of doing was at the Battle of Hattin.
In June 1187, the forces that Saladin had gathered began to assemble in this broad plain down behind me here. We can imagine streams of Muslim horsemen and foot soldiers coming in from Iraq, from Syria, from Egypt.
Saladin had thrown down the gauntlet, and Guy had to respond. He assembled the entire Christian force from castles and cities across the kingdom. 1,300 knights, including Templars and Hospitallers, and 15,000 foot soldiers.
14 miles in that direction, behind that modern settlement and over the hills, was Safaria, the base where the Frankish army gathered.
As their standard, they carried the most prized holy relic, the true cross. They believed it would protect them from defeat and ensure victory. Today, many Catholics still believe in the power of holy relics.
Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus.
In a tranquil monastery in Jerusalem, protected in a gold reliquary, lies a fragment of what is said to be the true cross.
The very little piece of wood in form of a cross is a part of the real cross on which Jesus was crucified. The cross is so precious to us. Can you imagine? We should not consider relics as magic objects. If we are protected by a relic, this is because God protects us, or His holy angels protect us.
Believing God was on their side, Guy, Renaud, and the Christian army were ready to face Saladin.
On July the 3rd, the Franks set out from their camp at Safaria in good order. Initially, the march went reasonably well, but as the day wore on, it got hotter and hotter and hotter.
With no water in the desert plains, the heavily armored Christian army suffered from severe dehydration.
In the heat of the day, the Franks were struggling intensely. They began to slowly lose cohesion, they began to lose formation. Like an enormous train slowly running out of momentum, going up a long, long hill, they ground to a halt. They were there at an open place, no water, hardly anything to eat.
Then, like an oasis in the distance, the Christians spotted Lake Galilee, a chance at last to quench their thirst. Saladin's biographer, Baha al-Din, revealed how that day his master laid a trap for the Christians.
The Christians, surrounding themselves with infantry, tried to fight their way towards the lake in the hope of reaching water. But Saladin realized their objective and planted himself and his army in the way.
Saladin and his men now stood between the Crusader army and the lake. Guy of Lusignan had no option. In a desperate bid to reach the water, he ordered a charge on Saladin's men. Weakened Crusader knights were no match for Saladin's highly disciplined army. Charge after charge was repelled by the Muslims. And at the end of the day, Saladin still had another trick up his sleeve.
In the summer, this place is a tinderbox. This stuff's incredibly dry. Saladin compounded the Crusaders' thirst by setting fire to it, and the smoke was driven onto the Crusaders by the wind and made their throats even drier.
The Muslim soldiers piled on the misery, creating a terrible, constant noise. Drums, cymbals, chanting, to inflict fear and foreboding on the Crusader army.
It must have been an awful experience to be stuck out in the open, knowing that really the following day you were likely to meet your death.
On the morning of July 4th, the Christians who remained prepared to make a final stand.
The foot soldiers saw here the Horns of Hattin, an old Iron Age fort where they thought they could be safe. They marched up this ascent here, and here in the crater was set up the red tent of King Guy of Lusignan. You can imagine here in this crater very evocative scenes. The few remaining 100 horsemen twirling around, trying to get themselves organised.
Chronicles record that the sacred gold reliquary holding the precious relic of the true cross was hustled into Guy's red tent for safety. As the exhausted Christians began to collapse, the disciplined Muslim army closed in for the kill. Sensing victory, Saladin commanded his troops to capture Guy, Reynold, and the red tent.
I was at the Sultan's side when we saw the Franks retreating before the Muslim onslaught. And I cried out for joy. We have conquered them. The Sultan turns to me and said, be quiet. We will not have beaten them until the tent falls. As he spoke, the tent fell.
The relic of the true cross was seized. Saladin's victory over the Crusaders seemed to be complete. July 1187, the Battle of Hattin was over. Orders with guards, and even scattered chalk dust and cinders around the tent to detect footprints. Still, despite the security, the assassins struck again, in a curious and disturbing way. By his pillow, they left a present, some pastry. In 1181, his rival, Al-Salih, now 19 years old, died. Like his father and grandfather before him, another victim to die in uncertain circumstances.
I have no problems in believing that Saladin was ruthless.
And with them a death note, warning Saladin to retreat, or next time they would succeed in assassinating him. Saladin fled Aleppo again. It was 7 years before Saladin's fortunes changed.
Ruthless. What's the problem? I mean, in order to survive in that world, you had to be. Whether he was responsible for the killing of Nur al-Din's son, one doesn't know.
Syria and Egypt now belonged to Saladin. 80 years of Muslim disunity were
The assassin actually got into his den must have created total panic. You can just imagine it.
A year passed before Saladin returned, determined to capture Aleppo. This time he was taking no chances. He ringed his